Hey friends, welcome back to my channel and to the second video of the series where I go through my study method and tips for each of my IB subjects. And today we will talk about chemistry, which is a subject that I've come to love so much. Chemistry is both a skill-based and a memorization-based subject, so therefore I use a combination of different studying methods to study and prepare myself for this subject. So let's get right into the video. So first, let's talk about taking notes, because this should be one of the very first things you do in order to study for this subject. Unlike psychology and biology, where I rely almost fully on digital notes, for chemistry, I use a combination of written notes and digital notes in the form of flashcards. So written notes come along when I first learn the content in class. So because my teacher, he has prepared his own notes from various textbooks, so during class time we can just copy down whatever he writes on the whiteboard, and that will act as notes that we can use later on to refer to when we are studying and when we are reviewing. And digital notes, on the other hand, is more of the process notes. Like after I studied the content in class and after I go through my written notes and skim through my written notes and see what are some of the things that I want to put in the form of flashcards where I can do active recall to help me memorize them. So in terms of my written notes, they're really basic. I don't do anything fancy because keep in mind, this is when I first learned this content and this is what I write down in class. I do use Cornell notes though, because I think it helps me in terms of seeing the topic headings when I'm studying and when I process through the notes again later on and convert it to digital notes. In terms of what I do for each chapter, usually for a topic, I always start with identifying the key terms and then write down the definition for key terms, and that's how I usually start a section of the notes. After that, there's just a lot of bullet points and a lot of example questions that my teacher presented in class. I just copy it down and show how we got to answer together as a class. So yeah, I just made sure it's at least clean and organized and not just a mess where I don't feel like looking at it at all. So while you're taking notes, I feel like this is something you need to do throughout your IB, when you're taking notes, and that's identifying things that you need to commit to memory and compile it in one place. This could be something like the definition of a term that often comes out, something like polyatomic ions, where you have to remember the charge, the formula, and stuff like that. Equations that you have to memorize, you can compile these things together and put it in one place so you can look at them right before you walk into your exam, so it's fresh in your mind. And so how I do this is I do it in the form of flashcards, where for example, list out the formula for phosphoric acid, list out the formula for sulfuric acid, something like that, and then I have the formula at the back of the flashcard. I use Quizlet, by the way. I just use digital flashcard, and so it's just helped me to memorize it. In terms of identifying stuff that you find difficult to memorize, I also make a random list where I just titled random. It's just a place where I write down stuff that are not on the data booklet, stuff that I have to memorize, stuff that I got wrong before. It's also a place of reflection where I reflect upon the questions I got wrong before. So let me show you my random list. I have it on OneNote, but you can have it anywhere really, at the back of your notebook if you prefer writing things down. Here, for example, I have the formula formal charge, where it's not on the data booklet, but I know I will use, so I just put it on there, just make sure I remember it. And some other things, for example, I got a question wrong on my equilibrium exam, and what I learned from that question, after talking to my teacher, is that I have a misunderstanding. I thought change of pressure would affect all solid, liquid, and gas, but what I learned from the question I got wrong is that it only applies to gas. So I wrote it down here to make sure that I don't make the same mistake again. So yeah, I find this very helpful. This random list is the only thing I look at before I walk into the exam, because at that point there's no point doing questions anymore. So it's just some of the things that you want to make sure are fresh in your mind when you walk into your exam, so you don't doubt yourself when writing questions. So next on, let's move on to how I use flashcards and how I make them. So for flashcards, like I said, one of the purposes I use it for is to memorize the things that you just have to commit to memory and there's no other way of knowing it. And so other than that, I also use flashcards to memorize definitions, because for IB chemistry, they often like ask you to define something. Like something very common is, for example, defining metallic bond, covalent bond, ionic bond. These are questions that have come up before and not only once. So I wanted to make sure that I do remember these definitions word by word based on what's written on the mark scheme. So I also put these there, and I organize it by topic. So for example, I put topic 2 and 12 together because it's the SL and HL topic, and then I just have all the definitions there. The way I make flashcards also, I also use the chemistry guide. So with each bullet point on the chemistry guide, it's a syllabus target. It's something that IB wants you to know. So I just rephrase that sentence and add an IB command term to force myself to do active recall instead of just like looking at the guide thinking that I know that bullet point already. In studying IB chemistry, I've actually made flashcards for all the chapters. I'll link it down in the description if anyone wants to use it to study. And so let's go on to the next study method where I address more on the calculation side. Obviously, we all know that past paper, it's an absolute necessity to studying IB chemistry, but the tip I want to give you here is like how to approach your past paper and like what things you should be doing when you're doing past papers that would help you to review later on and that would help you to prepare a guide for yourself. One purpose of doing past papers is to figure out the commonly reoccurring question types. IB often give the same type of questions. So this means that they might be asking for the same thing, but the options given are different, or the values are different, or even the wording might be exactly the same, but they just change the values or they ask for something else. Why do you need to figure out question types? Because if you've done this question before, you've already figured out how you want to approach that question. And if the same question type comes up on an exam, you know immediately how to approach that question and you don't have to give a second thought about it. So this really saves a lot of time in terms of like buying yourself time to check the answers later. Trust me, you really do need a double checking time for your chemistry exam. So in terms of a question type, let me provide you an example here. So for this question here, the question asks which molecule contains a chiral carbon. And for this other question here, from an entirely different year, it asks which molecule has a chiral center. So as you can see, the wording is a bit different, but they're asking for the same thing. And you can see that the options given in the question are different. What you want to learn from past papers is how you approach the question. To find a chiral carbon, you basically need to find a carbon that's attached to 4 different groups. And this might take some practice because you might not know what counts as a group, for example. But if you've had enough practice, like for example from this first question on how to find a chiral group, like you wouldn't have a problem doing this like second question. It's just like get your brain used to like doing this type of question. Towards the end, when you do like full past paper questions, you can also figure out what are some of the mistakes that you commonly make. For instance, sometimes I misread the question. I forgot that it says like give your answer to 2 decimal point, and so it's very important to learn from these mistakes and make sure you just don't do this mistake again. And also doing past paper just helps you identify some misunderstandings you might have with the topic, and so just talk to your teacher early enough to get that misunderstanding out of the way so you know exactly what you're doing during the exam. So now let's move on to paper-specific tips. So the first tip for paper 1, which is a multiple choice question paper, is that if you really forgot whatever the question is asking, try to identify the similarities between the 4 options that will be given, and then choose the answer where this option doesn't have that similar trait as the other options. By doing this, at least you make an educated guess and not just like randomly choose an answer. So to provide an example, in this question, it asks which solvent is aprotic, and some people might forgot what is an aprotic solution, but if you look at the options here, you'll notice that both A, C, and D contains hydrogen bonding, while option B doesn't. So if you make an educated guess, like if you really just don't remember what aprotic is, like just pick answer B, and answer B is the correct answer. So this is something that you can do that might save you from like getting another question right. And in terms of paper 1 mathematical calculations, like especially in stoichiometry, don't overthink things because paper 1 is supposed to be a non-calculated paper, and the values they give you are values that are easily calculated. So if you do find yourself like getting some weird values like 2, 3, 4, 5 decimal places and stuff like that, you're probably doing the question wrong. If that's the case, just put it aside first and then just do it later on. Sometimes you come back with a fresh mind after doing other questions, you might actually like approach the question correctly. And then for multiple choice paper, please do read the question carefully because sometimes the questions can be really tricky. Well, a friend of mine, that question asked for which one has the shortest bond. He saw the longest bond and he chose the wrong answer. Just things like that. So make sure you do highlight the key terms, highlight what the question is asking for. Just like make this a habit. Like whenever you do papers in class, do past papers on your own, practice really makes a habit, and just like practice this over and over again, and then you'll remember to do that in your exam. And also another thing for paper 1 is you do have to transfer your answer from the paper to an answer sheet. It's really a possible like stupid mistake that you might have done if you're like too nervous. So what I did was I transfer answers one at a time. So after I did question 1, I transferred it to my answer sheet. After I did question 2, I transferred it to my answer sheet, and so on and so on. So I just make sure I check every single time, because I feel like if you do transfer all the answers all at once, it's easier for you to like skip one, and then if you just transfer like the rest of the things wrong, like they differ by one question, it also takes you time to like erase it and then cross it again. So I just make sure I do it like step by step and do it one at a time. So next, let's move on to paper 2 tips, which is the larger paper that is worth more marks. So for paper 2, most of the time it's mainly calculation questions. Sometimes there's like questions where you have to write a couple of sentences, but most of the time it's calculation questions. For calculation questions, I in the past suffered with that because I am not very good at math. Sometimes I don't understand, why do you have to multiply this? Why do you have to divide it by this? Like, I just don't understand. Like, it just doesn't work in my brain. And a tip that my chemistry teacher told me is to follow your units. To give you an example, we learned the formula that moles is equal to the mass of that thing in grams, and then divide by the molar mass. And how do you derive like this formula? Like, if you look at it, moles have the unit of moles, and then your molar mass has a unit of grams per mole, and therefore the mass of the thing in grams is equal to the number of moles times the molar mass of the substance. And because the unit of moles is moles and the unit of molar mass is grams per mole, you'll notice that the two moles cancel out and you're left with grams, which is the unit for the mass of that substance. This was very eye-opening to me because I didn't know you can approach chemistry this way. But yeah, I found this tip given by my chemistry teacher super helpful. And so during the test, sometimes like if you don't know what you're doing, like you don't know how to approach the question, look at the units. Like, it's so important. Like, there's units of like stuff in data booklet as well, so just get it like in section 1 and 2 of the data booklet. Yeah, this is something I just found like really helpful, that saved me because yeah, at the beginning I was not good at chemistry. Stoichiometry, I suffered a lot because I didn't know what I was doing. And in terms of calculation questions as well, practice the habit of writing your working process down. That means not just writing the final answer. If you happen to calculate the thing correct, you'll immediately get like 2 or 3 marks, like whatever the question's worth. If you get the calculation wrong, it's only a 0. But if you have like all your working process on how you got to answer, the examiner can give you some follow-through marks. Just keep in the habit of writing things down, and this also, it helps you to organize your thoughts as well. And what about for other types of paper 2 questions where it's often like a command term type of question and then you just have to write something? For this one, I can only say just do a lot of past paper questions. It is similar to paper 1 where the simpler types of questions come up. For May 2021 exams, there were actually questions that I think are identical to past papers that came up. For example, this question asked us to draw like sigma bond and pi bond. Like when we were in our first year final exam, the whole class, only I knew how to draw that because I happened to do the past paper before, and now because we've encountered that question before in our final exam, all of us knew how to do it in our actual exam. This one, I know past papers, it's so dry, it's so mundane, but it is so important in terms of like getting a good grade. And sometimes it's about the wording. For some things, like if you miss this like one word, they can't give you the mark. And how do you know if they want this word? The only way to know it is through like mark schemes. So yeah, there's nothing more I can say about this. Just make sure to spend some time to do past papers. And moving on to some other general tips, I want to talk about past papers again. What I did was I did topic-based questions from past papers every time I finish a chapter. I guess this just helps you to consolidate the knowledge like topic by topic instead of doing everything at the end. I just found this really helpful because I found like towards the end when I was studying for the actual exam, I still remember the questions that I did before when I was studying for a unit exam. So if you just do this like bit by bit every time, towards the end you'll have all the knowledge you need. And along this way, if you do encounter questions you don't know, ask your friends, teacher, make sure you know why you didn't understand the question or why you got the question wrong. A rule that I have for myself is just that you have to figure out exactly why you got things wrong, because a same type of question might come up exactly on the IB exam, and during that time you might regret for not asking that question more clearly enough to your teachers or your friends. And whenever I ask my teacher and friends, I find something very helpful. It's like I always vocalize my thought process, like how I got to this other answer that was wrong. And then because by doing that, your friend or teacher can help you identify the exact place where your thought starts to go in the wrong direction that led you to the wrong answer. And also sometimes I found helpful is like when I don't know how to approach this question, I can see how my teacher and friends, especially my teacher, how my teacher approaches it, and I just learn from how he approaches the question, which usually is like much better than like how I initially approached it. Another tip is to look at the chemistry guide. Look at it over and over again. Like you have to look at it all the time. And why? Because your teachers are humans. Like they're not machines. They will also forget to teach you possibly like a syllabus topic or like just something that should be like an SL content but your teacher thought it was an HL content, something like that. These are all possibilities. So it's your responsible to figure out if your teacher is teaching you what you need to know. If you see something that is like unfamiliar, just go ask your teacher. Go ask your teacher and then you guys can figure things out together. It's so much better for you to just like make things clear before exam than to notice that you've never learned this thing during your exam. And another thing my teacher told me is like towards the end, if you're really short on time, know what to prioritize the things you want to study. For some topics, it comes out every year. For some topics, it rarely comes up. For example, the pro-tick question that I gave as an example before, that I think that's the only question that came up before. Maybe there's another one. And it's usually only worth 1 mark or maximum 2 marks. So if that's the case, if you really just don't have time to study it, it's okay, leave it there. Study all the big topics that usually come up, like bond enthalpy like often comes up, electrolysis like in terms of labeling the anode, cathode and everything, that always comes up. But for example, in terms of electrolysis, the Coulomb, whatever, how many charge thing in HL topic, it rarely comes up. Remember, the IB exam, they won't test you on every single thing you've learned, but you still have to study for everything. And my last tip is to just like make this one rule for yourself. And this is a rule I gave myself like since my first day of IB, and that is to not make the same mistake twice. And I feel like if I fully learned all the mistakes I've made in my life, I'll be a Superman right now. We always make mistakes, but if you can learn from these mistakes, you will benefit so much. For example, on my stoichiometry exam, I was 1 mark away from a 7 because I didn't see that the question asked us to give the answer to 2 decimal places, and I gave it to like maybe 1 decimal place. And from that time on, I made sure I look at the question and make sure I do address this and follow their instructions if it does come out. Yeah, lunch. So yeah, that's all the tips I have. I hope you find it helpful. I know sometimes I get a bit rambly and stuff, but I really hope these things in this video, you do discover some things that you didn't know before. And yeah, so thank you very much for watching, and be sure to subscribe for my next video, which is on how to get a 7 for IB English, and see you in my next video.